This is the There Is Another Way podcast from spencerbruce.com. Making life work as a creative. Hello there and welcome to this week's There Is Another Way podcast. Hope you are all safe and well out there. Today, I'm really happy to say we have Gareth Davies from the Sound Boutique, composer, podcaster, so much more. So sit back and enjoy the deep chat that we have. Hello, Gareth. How are you doing out there?
I'm very well, Neil. How are you?
Very good indeed. Thank you so much for offering up your time to be on the There Is Another Way podcast. It means a lot to us.
Yeah. It's nice to be asked, actually. I've been doing a fair bit of work in the podcast space, so it's nice to be on the other side.
Well, that leads us on to the kind of like the first question. Can you just tell us a little bit? I gave a little bit of an introduction to you, but can you just tell us a little bit more about your creative business, your creative practice, and what you do?
Okay, so I used to be a primary school teacher up until 2011 when I took the leap. I knew I wanted to do something with music. I've always been a musician. I grew up, going through the grades and stuff like that. And it's always been my second language, I suppose, much like you, much like a lot of our peers. And I just knew, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a soundtrack composer or a guitarist or, whatever it was. And so I set up a limited company and I quit teaching. And then I went, I have no idea what I'm doing, much like many people in this industry. So the Sound Boutique, it was named for that reason. I didn't know. I wanted it to be fairly all-encompassing, but I also wanted it to have that kind of handmade feel, the homemade, the boutique feel. Yeah. So
it's a great name. I think a lot of people, myself including, do struggle with that idea of a brand, particularly in an industry or in creative industries where you end up doing a few different things. It's very hard sometimes to get a name which can symbolize all the different things you do and doesn't put you just down one box.
Yeah, and a lot of people like to go down that route. If you're a drummer, then you want everything to be really branded down that drumming route. But because I wasn't entirely sure, and I love the variety, I love the fact that one day I can be scoring a soundtrack for something and the next day I can be out with my field recorder and the next day I can be producing a podcast. I love the fact, and we've spoken before about music is sound, sound is music. And I really buy into that. I love the variety, and I'd be a little bit sad if I had to do one thing for the rest of my career. I like the fact that, the variety is there, definitely.
I think it's kind of symbolic of where we are in terms of the times, the COVID times. We can't deny that, but I mean, just in the last couple of years, where there is an expectation, I think, of maybe from composers or audio engineers that you have to kind of put your toe into a little bit of these different ponds. You can't just be completely focused in one area.
Yeah, there's a word, diversify, which is getting more and more popular. And I think part of it is a fear that in the composing community, we don't know where it's going. We're seeing a big move onto streaming platforms. And for the folks who don't know, the broadcast royalties for streaming platforms are very different to terrestrial TV and things like that. So I think a part of it is a little bit of self-protection, having different pots to draw from.
Funny you should say the word pots. Pots is actually a title of one of the episodes I did very early on the podcast of how you kind of need to sometimes maybe have different pots of income. And I think maybe COVID and everything that's going on right now really shows the importance of that, because for my own self, my gigging pot is gone. That's it, gone. There are some other pots there that enable you to kind of carry on.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, for me, using the lockdown as an example, I work on an animated series for CBBC that they got some episodes out of the gate, but of course there's going to be a break while the lockdown happens, and so I'm facing a break now. But at the start of the lockdown, I thought, well, what can I do? How can I pivot to keep going and to build something else up, which is what happened with the podcasting. My fellow composer Dan Watts and I started a podcast last year called Making a Soundtrack, which we almost didn't intend. We collaborated together, and it turned out we decided, well, if we're going to make a soundtrack to an imaginary TV drama, why don't we make it a public thing? And then if we're making it a public thing, why don't we have guests on who know what they're talking about? And so on and so forth. We ended up making a 19-part podcast series, which we're really proud of. And we're actually in the middle of production for series 2. But so I almost fell into it by accident, but in the process found that I'm completely in love with with the medium. It's absolutely amazing. So that when lockdown happened, that was my little pivot. I thought there's an opportunity here. I know I'm going to have a break from scoring animation. So make the most of it.
It's an absolutely excellent podcast. And what I really enjoy about it is the diverse range of people you have on it. And you can find inspiration in different mediums as well. It's not just, looking at musicians to be inspired to be a musician. It's looking at like set designers and looking at all these other people, and you can take little nuggets away from them and go, yeah, that's something I can bring into my practice, which I found really enjoyable about listening to the podcast.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because that was definitely intended, that it should have it's a very niche subject. We do go down the nerdy route of arrangements and choosing instruments and stuff like that. Hopefully it's enjoyable to people who don't know some of the terms, but we also were very mindful to pull back the curtain on some of the jobs in TV production that people might not realise. The script writer, the director, the post-production, sound effects, and everything that kind of comes together to make the production.
It's interesting
possible.
you say that, because it's one of the things one of the courses I teach on, an audio engineering course, it's one of the things we try to do is to show people kind of come in with this, or students come with this idea they want to record bands, and that's it. And it's really funny when you start showing some of these other jobs that are out there, such as dialogue editing or sound design or anything in audio post-production. A lot of them go, oh, I really, really enjoy this. I'd never want to record a band ever again in my life. Why would you? So I think broadening your horizons about the whole industry can be really beneficial, because there are these little jobs that you just may not know about or see.
Yeah. And I think nowadays there's no excuse. It's so easy to, you don't have to have a big commission to produce a piece of work. You can pick up your recorder or your camera, your phone. You can pick up your phone and produce something on that. You can edit video. You can edit music on it. You can record sounds to use. It's so easy to get started. So I think there's never really been a better time to be creative.
Again, I think this is a message that's come across on the podcast over from all the guests we've had on, and something my own mantra is, thinking about where we were 20 years ago, the barriers to entry and the cost of entry into this industry were phenomenal. And now there is none. You have one on your phone.
Yeah, when I left university in 1994, it was exactly that. I walked out the building thinking, I have no idea. I don't have the budget to buy all this equipment. Yeah. I have no idea where to get started. And, we discussed earlier about those who can't teach, which is absolute rubbish. I ended up doing teacher training. I had a few music pupils and things like that, but I just didn't know what to do. And I thought, well, I know how to teach, so I'll go and get a formal qualification. But yeah, nowadays those barriers aren't there, like you say.
And you can publish yourself. You can be out there, within even an hour, you could make something and put it online. There's still areas of quality and content and story and narrative which take time to learn, but you can get the practice in, which I think is the most important.
Very much so. Very much.
Which
so.
leads us on to the next kind of question: who or what inspires you or inspired you?
Oh, that's a really tricky one, because if I was just a soundtrack composer, I could probably list a few people. But even then, I think especially in the world of sound, I think it's important to find your own voice, isn't it? And to try and sound like yourself. I think a big mistake that a lot of people make when they're starting out is to try and emulate someone else. And I know I've heard guests on your podcast speaking about this very thing. I find that the people who inspire me are the people who are doing what I want to do. And I kind of look at what they're doing. You know, in the podcast space, there are loads of podcasts that I enjoy listening to. And I just try and listen with regards to how they're producing it, how they're interviewing people, what makes that chat so special, and things like that. And how does it sound? What equipment are they using to make it sound that good? So from that perspective, I suppose there are people who inspire me. But from a creation point of view, from a content point of view, I can only be me. That sounds a bit cheesy.
No, not at all. I think it's one of those questions that kind of gets asked, and I always find it really, really difficult to answer because it depends on what day of the week it is. What I'm doing is to where that inspiration comes from. For me, it's the medium, I think, overall that inspires me because you can look at this with either sound or music or the fact that they are interlinked. But it seems the more I know about the subject, the more I realize I don't know and there is to know. And that just fascinates me on a daily level of like, you know, you think you've got to a certain point with music theory and then something else opens up and you go, oh my God, it's never ending. And it's like this quest for more knowledge, but it just inspires me to keep going and figure things out.
Yeah, I think that's possibly where I differ because even though I did a degree in music, I did A-level music, I did the grades, I don't really consider myself to be academic as a person. So it's not likely that I'll sit down and read a book by someone and, learn about their teachings, which is probably to my detriment. I probably should do more of that. But I'm very much a go with the feeling type of person when it comes to creativity. When you get that feeling in your gut and you think, yes, that idea is going to work, that's what I go with more.
That's something that, again, really fascinates me and came up on last week's podcast. We kind of ended up with using a term for it, which, it sounds wrong, which is the word magic. But there is a magic.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that you're sat there, as we all have been, with a blank canvas, no matter what discipline you're in, a blank DAW screen, and then something exists, comes into existence. Where did it come from?
Yeah. And I totally get the point you were trying to make, which was about your Friday nights for a year and stuff like that. And I think it's about the stars aligning. There can be little variables that mean that day the magic's not going to happen. And I think really as the difference between maybe starting out and getting more experience in something is that you recognize that. And so, you can wake up one day and think, no, it's not going to happen today. Do something else. Or, if you're on a deadline, then there are mechanisms to cope with that and to maybe work through something more logically than if you wouldn't have a brief, for instance. So, yes, there's definitely an X factor.
But I think that relates to all great art and great artists because, one thing I say to students, again, keep bringing this up, but is, you look at great albums, let's just go for the classic album things. A lot of those artists then spend the rest of their career trying to recreate that magic that happened on that day at that time. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not successful.
Look at Christopher Cross. That first album won about a zillion Grammys. And was it first 2 albums won awards and then nothing? I think that's a perfect example of it. He put everything into those 2. But you know what? If you have created something like that and that is your career's highlight, then great. I think that's absolutely fantastic. He's obviously poured all his creativity into those things. That's way better than them not having existed at all, I think.
Funny talking about existence, it just reminded me of something that came up the other day. It was the idea of some of these great pieces of art, music, film, whatever. It's hard to imagine that they didn't exist. I find that sometimes about great pieces. It's like, you can't think of a time when that song didn't exist. Even about current classics, it's like, I don't know, it's always been there, surely, because it's...
Yeah, very much so. And, growing up, when we were kids, that history of maybe the pop rock side was a lot shorter. And so I think we've kind of witnessed the evolution of music on that side of things and witnessed a lot of classics come into being. Yeah. I was thinking of Radiohead, The Bends the other day, and I'd just come out of uni, and that for the 80s, which was lots of synth pop, to hear that sound, the grunge scene from Seattle and things like that. But then to hear this British band producing a sound like that was quite amazing for me. That still is one of those albums that stands
I mean, I think they say it's fortunate to have been through some of those moments in history where things come out. They seem so normal these days, but at the time, I seem to remember Nirvana as well. The first time I heard that, it was like, what is this?
But do you think that, in turn, the expectation is raised to, because it seems so normal, then, these classics are expected?
That's a really good question.
In the kind of new normal. The new normal is to release a classic. Yeah. Whereas before it was like, they seemed to come out of nowhere, didn't they?
I've got another theory about that, but it's purely a kind of Anglo-centric theory about it, in the fact that I think a lot of these classics came around at a time when the social structures in the UK were quite different. So a lot of people of those times were kind of on the dole, and we paid for music and entertainment and creativity because you could go on the dole and you could live in very cheap accommodation. So the overheads in terms of your expenses was very low, and it's completely different to what it is now, and the expectations of, a younger generation and what's expected of them. So they don't have that time to just experiment with musical or comedy or different forms. You could also argue, and I've seen this argument, this is not my argument, someone else's argument, that money spent on those people was basically paid for itself in tax returns later. So
it's an interesting
talking about television writers as well, and script writers in the early 80s who were, again, probably on the dole or claiming benefits and sat away in a squat somewhere writing masterpieces with no pressure. Whereas again, I think kids these days, and there is a lot of pressure, and there's not enough time to get in that headspace of just being of free thought. And there's, going back to your original point of then the expectation that it must be a classic straight out the bat.
Yeah, and I think that's also a very personal journey that you have to go on. If you assume that the first thing you're going to do is going to be the most amazing piece of work ever, then you probably need to have a conversation with yourself.
I think one of the things we're used to dealing with, and perhaps the younger generation really struggle with, is this idea of rejection. And what are your feelings about rejection? Because I'm sure, and we've all had a lot of rejection, and that's what makes us strive to be better. But it's something that I feel can be very hard to deal with, and particularly if you're younger and starting out. We talked about the pluses of the world we live in and the ability to create content, but also the ability to get more rejection is probably higher now.
Oh, it's a very important part of being creative, and not just rejection, but how you deal with rejection and how you make it inform what you're doing. It's something I learned the hard way, even to the point, you can pitch for things and get a no, and you can take that really personally, or you can switch it around and think, well, what I've done doesn't quite fit, it's a slightly different shape for that whole. It's nothing personal. Quite often in that scenario, people will say, we like what you did, but it's not quite right for this. And that's absolutely fine. So even on something like making a TV production, I come up with a soundtrack for a show. And very early on in that stage, because I wasn't used to getting feedback, I was very much I'm doing everything from the heart. And if you don't like that, then I'm going to be crushed. And when I got the first notes, I realized that I'm telling someone else's story. I didn't get involved until maybe 4 or 5 years after this concept had been conceived. So there is an element of getting over yourself and realizing that this take isn't what we are looking for. Doesn't mean that they think you're a bad composer or bad at what you do. It just means that together as a team, we're going to figure this out and make it the best it can be to tell that story. And I think that's a really important thing to realize for people who are going into it. And, receiving emails which might not be what you want to hear. I think you need to stand up, walk out of the room, go make a cup of tea and just let it go and look at what what the sender is saying and respond in a very logical, calm way.
I guess my approach to explain it sometimes is it's a bit like, you being in the world and going around the world. It's how many people you come into contact, but how many people become either your partner or your friends. It's not tons.
Yeah.
You meet a lot of people, and some people, and that's exactly how it is until people are looking for that right match. And as you said, it's particularly with TV and film productions, it's a team effort, and everything is trying to be the best it can be. So it's definitely not about you. If it's your own personal artwork, then that can be a little bit harder to be rejected. But again, it's not for everyone, and that's probably a good sign. I always think if you get 50% of people hating what you do and 50% liking what you do, you're doing pretty well.
And a reaction is better than no reaction at all. Indifference is is the worst.
And don't listen to what people say on the internet, I think, is the other thing as well, because yeah.
Oh, for sure. But, the internet can be a real force for good. It's just that you have to accept that the bad comes along with the good. And I guess what you do with that, which hopefully is largely ignore it. So
moving on and thinking about a bit more about your business and what you do. If you were to give some advice to someone else, what do you see as what are barriers to what I call there is another way lifestyle, but let's call it the freelance lifestyle? What do you think the barriers are to the freelance?
Barriers to the freelance lifestyle. Well, I suppose as a freelancer, you're always looking at the next gig. The barrier there to overcome is the fact that while you are doing a job, you have to be still out there networking. You have to still be forming those relationships. It's very easy to feel kind of a false sense of security when you're in and working and feel like you don't need to do that. You think, oh, well, there'll be another job along afterwards. And once I do this and people see it, then that'll be great. But it doesn't work like that. There are peaks and troughs. And I think the moment you become proactive and see that proactivity is important to your work and your business, you'll do a lot better, for sure.
And speaking of gigs and such, what would be your dream gig?
That's so hard. Because as I started, the Sound Boutique was born out of the variety. There are so many different things I'd love to do, and
put you on the spot there.
That's a really tricky one. I've never been in certainly in the composing community. I've never been one of the composers who has said, "Ooh, the dream is to go to LA and become a big Hollywood composer." I've never really. I don't know why, and it's for some people and it's not for others. But I've never really seen the allure in that. I think in this country, the quality of production is just, and especially nowadays, is off the scale. It's absolutely amazing. I'm lucky to be involved in some of it. I would love to do live action, I suppose. I do more animation. So that would be very interesting. And actually having done making a soundtrack and really changing the mindset to a kind of a live action drama setting, that would be a really interesting thing to do, I think. And the podcasting side, it's a bit of a swings and roundabouts situation for me, because yes, I'd love to be commissioned by the BBC and go down that producing route. But of course, then you give up some of the control. And, the podcasts I produce for myself and with my friends, I retain that creative control, and you can put out exactly what you want to put out. And there's no, it's because of that meddling or whatever that it's failed, or, it's, I love the fact, Creative Cuppa, I was lying awake on a Sunday evening and I had this idea and I thought, wouldn't that be great? And by the Friday, I'd booked my first guest and designed the logo and, all that kind of malarkey. And I love that. I love that you can just create things out of nothing. That we're creators. That's what we should be doing. Dream gigs, there are some, but I don't think it's the end of the world if you don't get them.
I think that's a really, really important point to make. And part of the reason I'm doing this podcast is to kind of be honest with people. And I feel, there's sometimes depending on who you listen to and who you watch, there's this idea, particularly in the film scoring industry, that, if you want to be a film scorer, you have to pack your bags today and turn up in LA and that's it, and go and work for 10 years cleaning someone's floor on the hope that you might get to touch a violin or something along those lines. And it's really not. And this kind of came up in last week's podcast as well, where we were talking about the band side of things as well. And there is this dream of the rock and roll lifestyle and being in a band. But I think you've been in bands as well. It's not necessarily like that a lot of the time. And there's nothing wrong with saying, actually, I don't want to go away for 9 months of the year and sit in a bus touring around the world. I still want to play the guitar. I still want to entertain people. I've just got to find a way of doing it on my terms. And that is totally possible.
Would be fun though, wouldn't it?
I think it would be for a while, but it depends on your bandmates, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I recently had a guest on, Emily Dolan Davis, who is a session drummer, and she has a series of podcasts, and much like yourself, a series of things that help other people to just be informed about these things. And one of her episodes is about being on a tour bus and all the things that you should consider to make it as good an experience as possible. And it's really worth checking out, because there are lots of things to consider. I think it as an isolated experience, it'd be tremendous fun, wouldn't it, to go around the world, have a tour? Yeah. But I don't know if that's sustainable over a whole career. I don't know. So it's for some people.
Sometimes it's down to your personality as well. And you might want to do these things. You might want to go to LA, but it might not work for you. I think just being advised that this is what you need to do, it isn't. There are so many ways that you could be doing film composing and be completely satisfied sitting at home in rural Scotland.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because I'm sure you give out lots of advice to people. I'm asked occasionally about what should I do for this, and it really is that. What works for you? And you can say, well, this works for me, but we are different people, and what works for me might not work for you. Yeah, I guess over the course of your career, you get to know yourself very well, and you have to do what's best for yourself. Yeah. And you're right, it really shows in your work then. If you're passionate about what you do, then it's really going to show. And I think that's the best course, really.
Yeah, you've got to be. And I think as well, the sound boutique kind of symbolizes, sometimes things change over time, and you've got the option to do different things. Because on this journey, I've certainly found areas that I definitely don't like doing, and definitely areas that I really do enjoy doing. But if I hadn't had the chance to do them, I would never have known.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I've tried a few things over the years, and 9 years in, I'm now getting to the point where I'm really comfortable with what I'm doing. And I can really see a future in the podcast side. I feel very lucky to be given a chance on the soundtrack side for productions. The library side is great, and keep doing that. Real world sounds is something I started and can happily sit there and maybe grow over the next few years. And screenless. I came out with an audio brand a little while ago. And again, it was one of those things that just happened overnight. I'd just done a pitch, funnily enough. And when you do a pitch for, I'm sure it's much the same for pitching in whatever industry you do, but it was when you do a music pitch for a TV production, it can take about 2 weeks, and there's a process. You are given a brief, you go for it for 2 weeks, you hand in your scenes, whatever you've scored, and then you have to wait for however long. It might be 3 weeks or something while they whittle it down and give you feedback. But of course, if you're going 100 miles an hour for 2 weeks and then you wake up the next day, your brain's still going to be going 100 miles an hour, despite you twiddling your thumbs and going, right, okay. So for me, I found that I had started writing silly rhymes, nonsense poetry. And I thought, right, well, maybe I should get this published. And so I went to a conference where I sat down with publishers who were saying, basically, if you're not David Williams, then there's very little money in getting published like that, which I don't know is entirely true, but starting out on that side certainly is. And I thought, well, what do I know? What's the Sound Boutique about? And it's about audio. I know audio. So I recorded them instead. And suddenly that audio brand was born. And now the 2 podcasts that I produce are on that screenless audio brand. And so, yeah, funny avenues. You find you go down little roads that hopefully feed into who you are and your identity.
Which also neatly feeds into the next question, funnily enough. And it's always a little bit of a trite question, but what do you think is what's your proudest achievement up to date?
Ooh, yeah, that's well, it's both a tricky question and a very simple question because proudest achievement could be something like getting on the BBC or getting, having your music heard around the world or, something like that that's quantifiable, I suppose. But I think my proudest achievement is getting going, learning how to almost training myself to get up in the morning, have an idea and say, right, how am I going to put that into action? And years ago, that might have taken me months. It might have taken me a year. It might take me 2 years to actually get round to figuring out how to get the wheels moving on something. And like I say, Creative Cuppa, I had the idea and I knew exactly what to do. It was a feeling. I just got going. And I think that's my greatest achievement, is to evolve into someone who uses action. My mantra is get things done, get it done. So it's really following that. I think that is my greatest achievement. But I could list, setting up audio brand and scoring. I tell you, one on the quantifiable side, the Christmas special on the BBC for Scream Street was, I don't know, it just got me a little bit, because growing up and seeing all these Christmas specials on TV, that for no apparent reason, just got to me a little bit. I thought, that's so cool. I've been a part of that.
That's excellent, because I think, from a number of guests, it always seems to be a similar thing. It's not necessarily about the award or whatever it is. It's always about being able to do this and making it work. Yeah. I think that's, for me, it feels like the first time you earned some money from a piece of your music. It's like you just prove to yourself you can do it. And once you've done it once, it's, in some regards, it's just a sense of repeating that procedure. It might take longer, it might take hard, it might be a ton of hard work, but it's doable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the other thing to be really proud of is connecting with people. I think a lot of what I do, I started collaborating with people maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Before that, I was very much an island. I don't know whether it was creative control or whether it was, I just feel like I can get my voice heard more when it's just me. I don't know what it was, but the moment I started collaborating, it was like a whole new world. And for those who haven't collaborated, I really, really recommend it, because you up your game, you find out things about yourself, about other people, you make new friends, you network, and that in turn can lead to other things. So that little switch as well was a big achievement for me.
That brings us back to what we talked about on your podcast earlier.
It's almost like I can see your questions.
It was a sense that, you asked me earlier about how things came about. A lot of it just came about by talking to people. The directions in my life were just happened through random conversations I had with people. That's how I ended up.
Yeah. Which again, advising people, how do I get started in the business? Well, it's a really difficult question to answer. But at the top of that list is network, isn't it? It's go and speak to people. Don't expect things overnight. Just go and start those relationships. That's how I ended up
doing a PhD. It was a chat with someone, a lecturer. I was doing a short course on composition and talking to the guy. I'm just chatting. And he was saying, "Oh, you're really into soundscapes and sounds." Like, yeah. And he goes, "Didn't you go to Salford University?" And I was like, yeah. He goes, "Oh, did you know they just had a whole bunch of cash to do a massive soundscape research project?" And I was like, "No, if you thought about doing a PhD?" I was like, "No, not." So he said, "Well, I won't give it a play." So I applied, and I thought the worst case scenario, I'll get a trip up to Salford, reminisce the old uni days for, and come back home. And what is it? 14 years later, I'm still up here. Yeah.
Wow. Brilliant. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? You can't. I mean, that's the exciting thing about life. I think is not knowing where you're going and being open to change.
Which is
Definitely.
spot on for the last question. There you go.
No way.
What would be your advice to other people on the journey, thinking about maybe starting freelancing, a creative business, or just wanting to change their life in general?
Yeah, I would say well, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because I took the leap. I was very lucky to be supported by my wife, who was kicking me up the backside, making me do it. And so I had that support. Some people don't. So it might be that you make a transition rather than a leap. Really think about what it is that you want to do and make it really simple. You know, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that makes you happy? What is your particular skill set? You know, if it's in illustration or graphic design or photography or whatever it is, start there, start small. And then just be, I think, singular in your approach. Don't try and do everything at once, because that will come later. Things grow out of things. You can't just, will them into being. It doesn't happen. So concentrate on something and try and get out and meet people in that area. Think about not just who's going to be paying the bills, who's going to hire you. Yes, of course, go and network with those people, but also network with your peers. I think it's almost more valuable to have that support group and that sense of community to give you the confidence to talk about stuff, celebrate news when it goes right, commiserate when it goes wrong. I think that's really important. And from there, you'll probably find there are opportunities as well. So, getting going, don't expect everything all at once, and network.
It's always about the networking. Well, I think we're just about up on time there. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
For anyone out listening, where can we find more information about you? Where can we check out your projects? I'll put them in the show notes.
Okay, so the Sound Boutique is quite simply thesoundboutique.com. Various social media networks, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as @GarethSounds. And you'll find the podcasts, Creative Cuppa and Making Soundtrack are on the website. But if you go to creativecuppa.uk or makingasoundtrack.com, they will point towards those particular pages.
And I will also say to our listeners, very worthwhile. If you're checking out this podcast, these are equally appropriate podcasts to go and have a listen to. So once again, thank you very much, Gareth, and stay safe out there.
You too, Neil. Thanks very much.
Thanks once again to Gareth for all his insightful knowledge. As usual, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please do hit the subscribe button. If you fancy going over to iTunes and leaving us a review, that would be greatly appreciated. And of course, join in the conversation on the Facebook group. There is Another Way podcast. All it's left for me to say is stay safe, and we will catch you later.